Um, I'm delighted to be here. I think, we just celebrated International Women's Day, and for whatever reason, it's turned into International Women's Week. I think we celebrated it this year at a really important time, particularly on the island of Ireland, because for sure I know that women's voices resonated over the last year, but it was probably a different Ireland that those voices were coming from. I think a lot of our women, through the lens of time, they were strong and articulate women like Noelle Brown and other survivors of the mother and baby homes. They were speaking with such courage and such power. And this time, their voices, they weren't going to be silenced. But I also think of the quiet dignity of women like Lindsay Bennett and Vicky Phelan, the cervical cancer campaigners, and both of them, one in Mexico and one in the United States at the moment, trying to get treatment. And, Vicky's given so much of her life, so much of her voice, so much of her precious time left on this planet to try and help women have a better future, certainly in terms of healthcare. But I'm also reminded of those courageous voices that are within our cultural and artistic community. People like Denise Chila, Emma Dabry, Erica Cody, they continue to show us the way in the last year in challenging racism in Ireland. When I think of our warrior women, I think of those women. Here in the Republic of Ireland, we're often talking about women in politics and in public life. But sometimes when I hear a woman like Catherine Connolly, who's the last Cearlia in Dáil Éireann, speaking with such articulation and quiet dignity, particularly over the last few months, wow, I'm so glad. I have such pride, that we have these incredible voices here on this island. And I don't know, by the way, how an Ireland which has treated its women and children so atrociously in the past could have given birth to such a powerful army of women, but I am so glad that it did. So, in a nutshell, I think the past year for me, when I think about women who have stood out, it's not because maybe they achieved great status in taking over companies or becoming billionaires. It was more that they were talking about what life has done to them rather than what they did in life. I want to just talk to you today about, of course, women's issues. I'm going to start with me, all about me. Well, I'm only starting with me because sometimes people have a different perception of who I might be. And I grew up in the Phoenix Park in Dublin. My father and my grandfather were rangers, and not to do an Angela's Ashes moment, there were 8 of us in a 3-bed house. My mum was a nurse and had to give up when she got married. So we survived on my dad's OPW wages. I went to a Deaf school in the Republic of Ireland. There are schools that are heavily supported by the government because they're in socially disadvantaged areas. So to understand the context of that in that school, I go back to it quite a bit. There were pictures on the wall of Joan Burton, who became Tánaiste to here. A little bit older than me, but reached the dizzy heights of deputy prime minister, and myself. And I always think that it's tragic that more girls aren't up on that wall. So that's how unlikely it was, maybe, that I went on to do what I did in my life. If you asked me when I was younger what I was going to be, I would never have said a businesswoman. I'd never even seen a businesswoman. In the Ireland at that time that I knew, the newspapers were full of men, the television was full of men, politics, public life, business, you name it. I was surrounded by powerful voices, but none of them were women. So I actually went and trained as a nurse in Scotland at 17 on the banks of Loch Lomond. And the only thing you need to know about that really is that someone who starts off in life wanting to be a nurse is not setting out in life to make millions. So, I may have, but that's not what I set out to do in life. I set out to try and make a difference. And I think in my lifetime, I've always been that blended human, that hybrid. So there's a huge amount of the nurse in me. I spent 5 years nursing and I still stay very close to the profession. And of course, there's the dragon or the businesswoman in me. Interestingly, if you had asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, given that I was raised in Dublin Zoo virtually, I would have said I wanted to work with animals. And there you go. I did get to work with dragons later in life, but unfortunately, they spoke back. So let's talk a little bit about the present, and particularly in terms of, I was listening to Mairead there talking a little bit about the statistics, but you know the wonderful thing about working with Vital Voices, I think my other job, although I still spend a lot of time working between broadcasting and business, I think particularly in the pandemic, I have been working very closely with Vital Voices. So I'm a global ambassador and I sit on the European board, and it was set up by Hillary Clinton and Madeleine Albright. And the great thing about Vital Voices is it supports women, not organizations. It works really hard to go into countries all over the world. I think in the video you just saw one of my mentees, Shilpi Singh, in Delhi in India, but it supports women that it believes will change. So sometimes it's a woman who will consistently stand for election in part of Africa, even though she never gets elected, but we'll support her, train her, mentor her, and give her every chance so that someday somebody will elect her to the government. A lot of women in public life, women in communities where we feel they could be the change agent, they get all of our resources in order for them to achieve their potential, and hopefully that to have a ricochet effect throughout the whole community. I am almost exclusively involved in economic empowerment within Vital Voices, which means that that growing recognition that actually, if women can be their own boss and earn their own money, then firstly, the whole community does benefit, their children, education, healthcare, but it also helps them to become independent and financially independent. So I mentor women in parts of the world that means it's doubly difficult. I mean, I think I mentor women here in Ireland, and I always think it's particularly hard. But wow, it's only when you go into parts of Africa and you're talking to women, amazing qualified engineers, female founders, and all the difficulties they're facing. There are no pandemic supports and grants and loans. There's no preferential treatment. There's no wage supports given to them all the way through this pandemic. I think. I've spent long hours working with those women and they have been phenomenal. I mean, Shilpi, that you just heard, ran a company called Unhotel in Delhi, which is a beautiful Airbnb type business. So if you go to India, instead of going to the big chain hotels, Shilpi could organize for you to go to beautiful homesteads in the forests and the valleys and the lakelands. Of course, when the pandemic hit, her entire business went under. There was no revenue whatsoever coming in from travel, internal or outbound travel. And herself and her husband, Manish, have swiveled that business into something called Studio 4, which is a digital platform. I work with another, you'll see this on my social media feed all the time, Ethiopian woman, Ada Bakri, who is in Brussels, and she runs a regulatory firm, but was primarily involved within the EU, working with the shipping industry. And of course, what was hit the most in the early part of the pandemic, but the shipping industry. And and actually, Ada has swiveled her business towards sustainable development goals, working with the textile industry and others to, I think for her, she's taken on more clients in the last year during the pandemic, which is a testament to her and her resilience, and also to Vital Voices and the work that it does with these incredible female founders. The second thing I'd say, and Mairead said it also, is that one of the big focus for us in Vital Voices is male allies. I think it's one of the most important things that men and women stand together in this regard. When Hillary Clinton famously said at the Beijing conference, women's issues, women's rights are human rights, then what she was doing is starting a conversation which has continued since then to say this isn't just about women talking about women's rights, this is about the whole of society talking about it. And if you look at our board, you will see incredible people like Diane von Furstenberg and others, but you'll also see some very powerful men sitting around that table. I'm really proud in Ireland that the president here, Michael D Higgins, is one of the few global ambassadors for he, for she, for the UN. He's an unbelievable man. I did a video with him last week, which went out for International Women's Day. He consistently supports diversity, inclusion, challenges unconscious bias, works with women in all manner of ways, not just in women in high places, but women in all sorts of pockets of society. But I also think that when you're asked what's the proudest day of your life, you're supposed to say, I think sometimes the day you got married or when you had your child, and all of those are really important. But I also remember buying my first business here in Ireland. I was running a group of companies for Smurfits, and to put it into context, I was the only woman out of 43 companies in Europe, and I reported to France. And I had tried to do a management buyout a couple of times. It was my second occasion when I managed to buy three companies actually in Ireland, on the island of Ireland. And I was walking over Baggot Street Bridge, and I cannot tell you the high that I felt because, as I said to start with, it was highly unlikely for somebody like me to end up buying the biggest publishing company in Ireland. It was phenomenal. But somebody sent me a card, and it really resonated with me. And it was funny, not necessarily in the right way, but the scene was a boardroom table, a cartoon effect of a boardroom table. And the chairman is the one who's speaking with the caption. And there's one woman sitting around that boardroom table. I have been that soldier many times. And the caption reads, "That's a really interesting point, Miss Brown, but we'll just wait for one of the men to make it before we take it seriously." And although it's funny, it also reminded me, really stark reminder, that actually when men speak, people listen. And I would like to say that that was the same for women, but unfortunately, I think it's the other way around at the moment, and we have to recognize that. So if I have a man standing up for women's issues, particularly a man of stature, who's held in high regard, then that is a powerful weight for us in terms of gender balance. So we can talk all the time about, the business case for gender balance, but people have to have the wherewithal. People have to have the ambition to achieve it. At the moment, without looking at the whole world, let's just look at Europe in terms of the pace of change for gender equality. We rise every year by about half a point, but we won't reach gender equality until 60 years have passed. So not quite the same as the whole world that Mairead was talking about. But, I think my great-great-granddaughter might be toasting a glass of champagne on the eve of 2081 to gender equality finally being achieved in Europe. And actually, the reason why we even go up by half a point is that it's driven by trailblazing countries like particularly Sweden and Denmark and France. In fact, the only countries in Europe that are actually making inroads into gender equality are those that have quotas. So speaking as a woman who said all her life, I don't think we need quotas, like almost all women of my ilk and my age, I have come full circle to saying we absolutely have to have quotas. There's no contest, no question for me. We will never achieve change unless we bring in quotas. And I don't know why we keep pussyfooting around and trying to pretend it's something that can be done voluntarily, because it can't. And I think in the UK with the Davis report, there was certainly some inroads, but we still haven't solved huge issues around the pipeline. It's okay parachuting women onto boards, but really our huge challenge is to make sure that women are growing up through the ranks from 23 all the way up into C-suite level. I think just to switch to the pandemic for the moment. So I started off talking a little bit about the past, but only because the past dominated Ireland this year, particularly in terms of women and how they'd been treated. And we've just talked about the present in terms of where we're at as we sit here today. But actually, the pandemic added a whole new layer. And in one sense, it was a brilliant layer. So let's go global for a second. I always say that if women ruled the world, it would be a better place. And there you go. We just discovered that in areas of the world where women rule, it is a better place. And it started off with Jacinda Ardern and people looking at New Zealand and wondering, oh, that's doing really well compared to the rest of the world. And then the critics came out and said, well, New Zealand's very remote and, the population has got a much bigger geographical area to spread out among. So, of course, they were going to achieve something better. But others were looking at what qualities and traits did Jacinda Ardern bring to the table that meant that she resonated much more strongly with her community. And then two universities in the UK got together and they did a study involving 196 countries, and 10%, only 10% of those countries were led by women. But what their research showed was that in those countries, the COVID cases were lower and so were the deaths. But then they went on to look at comparisons between those countries. I'm talking about countries like Finland and Taiwan and Germany. There are others. They looked at comparisons between those countries that were female-led and comparable countries in terms of size and geography that were male-led, and they still outperformed their male counterparts. So what's great is, we've proved the business case time and again. It's incontrovertible, irrefutable that gender balanced businesses outperform their competitors on almost every metric, return on equity and profit. But also, we've now shown that in a time of crisis where women rule, it actually is much better in terms of the outcomes. And Christian Lagarde, back in the recession, it begs the question why? Because, women aren't fairy godmothers. There has to be something there that's a little bit different. But Christian Lagarde said at the last recession, if we had more Lehman sisters than Lehman brothers, we'd be better off. Everyone knows that phrase. But she elaborated on it a few months ago because she was asked, what did you mean by that? And of course, she meant that women are risk averse. But she said, I also feel that when it comes to a crisis, women really step up and take their responsibilities seriously. And they also do so with a certain amount of clarity. They're pragmatic, they're empathetic. Most women, certainly ones that have children, are very used to being grounded in real life. They understand and know what it's like for people to be hit with a cataclysmic event, which isn't about their working life, it's about the whole of life. So there is a way of communicating and there's a way of handling that crisis that women are particularly adept at. They're also very good at looking into the future. And, I don't know if you know this, but uniquely women do pros and cons. I mean, it holds them back in other ways, but women are risk averse. They're very good at saying what could happen and what could go wrong if I take a particular course of action. And that's what dealing with the pandemic required. And I certainly feel I'm not a political person at all. I've never joined a political party, but we could do with that sense of leadership here in Ireland, I can assure you. So the great thing about the pandemic is that this women leaders and the recognition and newspapers and the media all over the world discussing that, the attributes of women leaders. But the downside is we also got hit with a she session, as they call it, a recession that's particular to women. So I think it started really early in Q2 last year, where we saw that 11 million women lost their jobs almost immediately. And since then, all of the research and the surveys are coming out showing that women, firstly, they are definitely more highly represented in the soft economy and in those carer roles, and certainly in part-time work, working in the economy, the unpaid economy. They're also probably last in and first out when it comes to the slightly larger corporations. Women tend to gravitate towards roles in marketing, HR, roles in a company that maybe could be seen as soft targets when it comes to downsizing. So the issue around this unraveling of some of the work that we've done about women and making inroads into corporate life and organizational life has certainly happened over the last year. And let's just talk for one moment about working from home, because I spent the whole of my life arguing that working from home would be the best thing for women. But actually, what Harvard discovered, they did a huge survey of women and men working from home. And of course, it is true that men took on more chores and more responsibilities in the home, but by far it was women who took on the lion's share. And I know I have a lot of corporate clients that I talk to all the time, and these women are describing days where they get up at the crack of dawn and get their children organized for school and school lunches and out the door, and then run in and work. For some reason, in the early days in particular, bosses seemed to want everybody to be on Zoom calls, from quite early in the morning to quite late at night. There was a fear that perhaps people would be at home and not doing what they were supposed to be doing and not being productive. So they thought they'd be more productive if they sat doing Zooms nonstop all day. But, in between Zoom calls, trying to get a wash in, trying to get the shopping online, or trying to run out the door to pick up the kids, or, get things organized for them to come back and have lunch and have some homeschooling or playtime organized for them with no home support. So what they discovered is 50% of the women in their survey were saying, if things continue like this, I actually don't think I can continue working. There's a group in Spain, they're called Bad Mamas, and I won't say the Spanish version of that, but they've been lobbying the government to change legislation to provide some protection for women at home. The interesting thing about the Harvard study is it discovered that men were more comfortable allowing the working day to seep into earlier in the morning and later at night. And that's because their responsibilities weren't the same. Whereas women were very defined by, I have to jump off now, it's 5:30, really have to get, bed, bath time, dinner, everything all has to be organized. So in those circumstances, it's quite difficult for women to continue networking There are certainly opportunities missed because informal networks that are built up prior to the pandemic, of course, still stay because friendships between men continue. But women would rely hugely on the formal networks, you know. Um, so working from home, if it does continue, there certainly has to be changes. So finally, let's just talk about solving the problem. I always say for women, it's confidence, not competence. I work myself, my own platform is called Planet Woman, which was a joke, by the way, to start with. I exclusively work between the age of 23 and 33. Nobody really needs me when they get to the point of trying to climb the ladder and get into the C-suite level in any company. They're already in a growth mindset. They're already doing those power breakfasts. They're already well networked within the community of women. But young women at 23 come out of university or college and usually have better qualifications than the boys. They love young girls excel at school. They like it. There's no rules. They understand how it works. They do their homework. They're diligent. I have a boy variety, by the way, when it comes to children. And I have some friends with the girl variety. So I know the difference between the two. But, you know, time and again, those elementary studies have shown that girls really excel in the very formal framework of a school where they're judged by their performance and merit. Interestingly, the education minister of years ago here, Gemma Hussey, once was doing a speech, and I was reminded of what she said when she was education minister, which is a few decades ago. The biggest thing that she achieved, she said, was she insisted that on the Leaving Cert exams, equivalent to A level, they take off the gender of the student who had done the test, and girls' results went through the roof. So I think that the system in academia and in second level education is such that girls do excel. So here they are out at 23, believing they can rule the world, better qualifications or equal qualifications to the guy. They go into the bank and he's 4 times more likely to go to the corner office than this guy, and she's more likely to have left by the time she reaches 33. It's a huge corporate pain for organizations. They describe a funnel that comes in, which is equal male, female, and by the time they get to their 30s, and it isn't all to do with having children, by the way, because when I called the initiative Planet Woman, I did it because consistently young girls were saying, I really feel that I'm on a different planet. And of course, when you have a baby and come back to work, you really are in the extraterrestrial zone of being somewhere quite different to the planet we're on here. So for me, this what's always intrigued me is this issue around confidence. And Harvard, again, I don't always actually quote Harvard, but just so happens they did this landmark study last year. I put it up on LinkedIn. It's a huge study of thousands of people, and it looked at that gender divide in terms of confidence. So what they discovered is young girls, 30% less confident than young boys. Certainly as they become young adults, that continues. In Dragon's Den, I saw that, young men would come in with a lot of bravado and a great deal of bravery and would pitch their business. And if that didn't work, they'd be back 2 months later with another idea. Probably confidence which completely outweighed their competence, whereas young women tend to, predict that they will do much worse in almost everything they do, and their confidence is significantly lower. The good news for those of you listening is when you get to 40, confidence levels equal between men and women, and magically at 50, women's confidence is higher than men. Anyway, I put that up on LinkedIn so you can find it, the Harvard study. So what intrigued me in my corporate life, given that I took over my first company at 30, a terrible boss, by the way. I think I was really good at what I did before I became the boss, which is why they gave me the boss job, but I wasn't really good at being the boss. I did a podcast recently on good boss, bad boss. I was by far the worst boss I'd ever met. So I took myself off to Ashridge Management College and studied strategic management for a couple of years. And I was also just coming off an MPhil at the University of Wales and a PhD. So I was kind of in that zone of constantly looking at studies and research. And my role for most of my 20s was publishing peer-reviewed journals with the British Medical Journal and others. So whenever there's a problem in my life, I completely rely on research. I am more likely to do a meta-analysis than anything else if I really want to know what's going on. If you watch any of my TED Talks, even in the area of domestic violence or in grief, you'll see they're a result of a huge amount of research and looking at the evidence and what's robust enough and what's peer reviewed. So what I was intrigued about is, I could see in my own behaviors, certainly, and in the behavior of women in my workplace, that these behavioral studies, as they call them, were true, that women did behave that way. So I brought together a huge team of researchers, and we looked at what's the difference between women and men in terms of how people get on within organizations. And it's a very new body of research. So for every one study that you read that says one thing, you might find one 3 weeks later that says the opposite. And that's because a lot of it is very subjective. Now, I always would exclude all of the ones that aren't properly peer reviewed, that aren't robust enough, that aren't subjective. So what we discovered is that those behavioral studies have been replicated so often as, you have to take them as almost verbatim. That's what happens to women. I can't say, I come across women and say, well, that never happened to me. Of course, it's not going to happen to everyone. But on average, most women don't ask for salaries as often as men do. So huge behavioral studies into this area. Men ask for a salary increase 4 times more often than women. And when women ask, they ask for 30% less. Women don't like to share their views in public. What all of the research shows is if you put a lone woman into a room with a group of men, she's unlikely to share her views, more likely with 2, with 3. The magic number is 1/3 of women at least. That's what we always talk about in politics, by the way, as well. Sitting around that table for women to feel comfortable sharing their views. They almost always predict that they will do worse in tests and in interviews. And this is tested amongst women who, for of varying age groups, young women in secondary and third level education, but also young women in their 20s, all the way through, that women, if you ask them to predict how they will do compared to men, they will always predict that they will do worse than they actually did. I think the other thing about women is they don't go for promotion as often as men do. And we know the Hewlett Packard study, which is decades old now, but has been replicated many, many times, which showed that men will throw their hat in the ring if they're around 80% of the list of skills and qualifications required for a job. And women really wait until they're 100%, if not higher, before they'll throw their hat in the ring. So there's quite a difference in terms of how women behave compared to men. So those behavioral studies, I think, led me to believe that although there are 2 things, always 2 things that hold women back in an organization. One is confidence, not competence, and those behaviors. And the second is the culture and structure of the organization. So although I do try to make inroads in culture and structure in various organizations, my focus is always on the woman herself. So there's enough other things holding you back without you yourself holding yourself back. So those studies led me to believe that, we need to help women. And thankfully, there is one thing for all the women listening. There's something called plasticity, which is this magic thing that happens if you can just quieten the voices in your mind and take the plunge and go for it in terms of the promotion or the job or, doing the PhD or even asking a question today. So plasticity works that when you can do it the first time, that you can do it the second and the third, and increasingly you get better at it, particularly in areas like public speaking. Also, I'm conscious of the fact that for every woman like me and Mairead and others that you've heard today, there are another 9 that fall by the wayside. So I gather women's stories, because through women's stories, you find out how did that one woman manage to break it? How did that one woman manage to get to the top? And there's almost always a story around plasticity and going for it. There's 4 things those of you listening need to do in order to achieve plasticity. 1, something needs to trigger you. Some call for action needs to happen in your brain. You want to go for that job, you want to start your own business, you want to ask that question, and the right time is right now. The second thing is you need to want to translate your thoughts into action. Women spend a lot of time ruminating, uniquely ruminating about things for a long time. Sometimes I'm helping a man who's mentoring a woman, and he said, I'm so frustrated. She's still talking about something that the chairman said to her 4 months ago. And I said, because she's ruminating on it. She's wondering, she's looking at every angle there. And that's about learning from negativity and learning from failure. It's something that women do really well. The third thing, you have to believe that you have the abilities to succeed. Like that Hewlett Packard study, you have to have that self belief to say, I'm going to ask for that salary and I'm going to succeed. I have the abilities to succeed. And finally, your desire to do that has to overwhelmingly be higher than your fear of failing. Because what most women cite as a reason for not going for the job, not changing career, not making that tough decision is that they're terrified that they will fail. So, somewhere in your mind, you have to reconcile that failing is okay and that there is the possibility that you might succeed. I think that the other thing that women need to learn, especially in the aftermath of International Women's Day, is don't lean in. I'm not into the whole lean in thing. Firstly, if it was easy as leaning in, we would have succeeded in gender equality by now. Lean back a little bit. Let other people pick up the slack, particularly in your home life. You know, I think if you leaned back and you weren't so willing to do everything in the house, or everything in the company, or everything for your boss, then you might be surprised. You're leaving space for other people maybe to fill in. The second thing I would say before I finish in terms of a fix is that for all of you listening in who may not be women, or who may be, people who founded or own companies, mentorship is key. 100% for me. All my life, I have been talking about mentorship. And if people ask me who were my great mentors, I, of course, lie because there was no such thing as mentors when I was trying to arm wrestle and elbow my way into boardrooms. I usually recount a casual conversation with a male boss, which led me to change my mind, which isn't mentoring at all. And in fact, having been through so many different programs on mentoring, I didn't fully understand the science behind it until I started working with Vital Voices all those years ago. And the reason is Vital Voices put a huge amount of effort and resources into mentorship, from matching mentors, training mentors, supporting them, helping to ensure that there's a foundation there for people to understand how they can actually support each other. I think that organizations, unfortunately, at the moment either have no mentorship. What the research shows is the majority of women don't have mentors. But worse, I come across increasingly women who have bad mentors, mentors who advise them wrongly. A typical thing that might happen in a company is that the company HR department suddenly decides, let's have mentorship. And they assign the mentors to the busiest men, usually at the top of the organization. And the women are calling me saying, well, he called me late on Friday and said, you're grand, aren't you? You know, I'm really busy and I don't really have time for this and I don't really understand what it's all about anyway. So should we catch up for a coffee in a few weeks when things calm down? So the women are saying, well, I don't feel I can challenge that because, he's busy and he clearly doesn't know how important it is to me. I have seen firsthand the difference that mentorship can make to women. I've also benefited from learning as a mentor from my mentees. But organizations have to take it seriously, not carve it off to some outsourcing company, not keep it within the realms of HR. They really have to see it as a mainstream activity within the business, because I know I can't save 100 women this year, but I can make a difference to 10 or 12 of them if I work hard and I mentor them. And I really think that's worth it. If organizations are struggling to try and get women to take on roles and to rise through the ranks of the organization, then mentorship is 100% the key. That 23-year-old girl who joined the bank, same qualifications or better than the boy, she goes in there and she looks up all the way to the top and she sees one woman and maybe two in the C-suite and three or four of them in the pipeline. No place for her. So I really think that mentorship, firstly, it allows uh, us to believe in ourselves when we don't believe in ourselves. Our mentor helps us to get up from the valley. All of us during the pandemic haven't been able to think strategically, not even in our personal lives where we always have sat navs, what I'm doing at Christmas, where I'm going on holiday, what I might do for a particular event. And in our working lives, exactly the same. We're stuck in the grind of everyday life. We can't even see what's happening next week. But mentors take you up from that valley and put you up on the mountain and help you understand what your potential might be and how, your future is way beyond the current crisis and the pandemic and the restrictions and how you might be able to get there. So I think that silencing those inner voices that chip away at our courage, I'm very familiar with those inner voices, is really important. Lastly, I would say that, you know, sitting here, International Women's Day, I'm very conscious that Mother's Day is also coming up on Sunday there. That's a hint to all of you who have forgotten.
Okay.
And I think about that a lot at this moment, especially because I try not to be the only person who goes up with ambassadorial tweets and Instagram posts and LinkedIn about gender balance, but it's inevitable at this time of year. I also try and put up, this very cool men like John Legend and Harry Styles who are complete supporters of gender equality. But when I get trolled, it happens a bit on LinkedIn, so that's a bit unsavory. But I think that this whole issue of women and men and whose job it is to pursue the gender equality route, I always remind them, firstly, I have a son, so I'm probably fighting for their daughters' futures and their granddaughters' future. But I also think that if you're out there, whether you're a chairman or a salesman, or you might be in legal, you might be a politician, you might be a writer, you might be a car dealer, but whoever you are, more than likely somebody you call mom gave up her dreams for you, gave up her pay, worked for less pay, sometimes no pay. So a woman invested in you, loved you, supported you, believed in you first. So why wouldn't you want to actually stand up for her and women everywhere so that that didn't have to happen again in the future? And thank you for listening to me. Happy International Women's Day if it's not too late.